I want to thank all of you for joining us. It is our pleasure to be joined this evening by the co-authors of Fierce and Fearless, Patsy Mink, the first woman of color in Congress. This is the fourth book discussion in our series highlighting ADA All-Stars as part of our 75th anniversary. Dr. Judy Wu is a professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine, and the director of the Humanities Center. And Dr. Gwendolyn Mink has been a professor of politics as well as women and gender studies. And of course, Judy and Wendy are both authors of numerous books, including working together on tonight's book. With that, I will turn it over to Judy.
Thanks so much, Don. And it's such a privilege to be able to speak to members of Migrants for Democratic Action, an organization that Patsy Mink was a president of. I was asking before we started recording how many people knew her. And if you missed that question, I'd love to find out about your connection with her. So feel free to put that into the chat. I'm going to give a brief introduction, maybe about 20, 30 minutes or so, about some of the key ideas in our book, and focusing in particular on the ways in which Patsy Mink's origins in the Pacific shaped her political vision. And then during the Q&A, Wendy, Mink, and I will both participate in that conversation. And I'm really looking forward, as I said, since some of you knew her, I'd love to hear your memories of her and your thoughts about her life and her politics. I feel like this, you maybe already know this, but maybe for those who are maybe signing in later, they may not know as much about Patsy Mink. She was the first Japanese American woman lawyer in Hawaii. And just given the demographics of the United States, that she was most likely the first one in the US, it was quite a struggle for her to become a lawyer. She initially wanted to become a medical doctor, but she applied in the aftermath of World War II with the returning GIs receiving benefits from the federal government for education, for housing. And so she met with very stiff competition when she was applying for medical school. And at the time, women constituted maybe 4 to 5% at most of medical schools. And so she was really denied, even though she had really prepared her whole educational career for that aspiration. And becoming a lawyer was really secondary to her. It was an afterthought. The one thing I found really interesting about Patsy's educational experiences, especially on the continental United States, is that the ways in which she was repeatedly thought of as an international student. So someone who was not American, even though she grew up in the territory of Hawaii and was a third generation Japanese American and therefore a US citizen. When she graduated from the University of Chicago in the early 1950s, she was one of 2 women in that class and also one of 2 Asian Americans in that class. She was the first woman of color to enter Congress, serving first 1965 to 1977, and then 1990 to 2002. As many of you might know, she passed away while in office. And one of the really moving things I found about her career is that even after she passed away, her constituents elected her to office as an indication of the respect that they held for her. I think a lot of people assume Shirley Chisholm was the first woman of color in Congress. So I think that says something about our racial imaginary in this country, and perhaps even our geographical imaginary, the ways in which we center perhaps the East Coast and not necessarily Hawaii and the Pacific in the way we think about the US nation. She's the co-author and defender of Title IX, and we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Title IX. When she passed away in 2002, it was renamed after Patsy Mink. And I'm sure we can talk more about Title IX, but as many of you, I think, understand, it's been most spectacularly noticed in terms of women in sports, but it really covered all aspects of gender equity in education. It was intended to address issues around admissions, around scholarships, about housing, about campus climate. So a very holistic coverage in trying to think about how to make educational institutions more welcoming, more equal for young women and girls. She ran for the US presidency in 1972 as an anti-war candidate. She was sort of drafted by activists in Oregon. and she had a very active campaign. Unfortunately, she did not succeed in attracting enough votes to be seriously considered. But I really admire her bravery in running and thinking that this was a possibility for an Asian American woman, and to use that platform as a way to talk about alternative ways to resolve international conflict and military conflict. And as I said earlier, she was president for the ADA, 1978 to 1981. And I don't know if it's still the case, but when she became president, the normal term might be 1 or 2 years. And so she actually had an extended, kind of length in office for having 3 years. And as you can notice from those dates, it was a very difficult time when the Democratic Party was listing to the right, and with Ronald Reagan being elected, very much a Republican revolution that was happening. And so I think that period is particularly interesting in ways that she's trying to mobilize a grassroots opposition, trying to recenter American politics to really think about progressive ideas of governance. And again, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that during the Q&A. So what are some of the ways in which we talk about Patsy Mink in the book? There's 3 main ideas. One is that she served as a bridge feminist, someone who really was just primarily operating in the political realm in Congress, but really thinking about the ways that she can put social activists into conversation with political legislators, the ways that she's bridging these different realms of politics. A second main idea that we talk about is how much she centered intersectional analysis in developing legislation. So she was thinking about women, she was thinking about workers, she was thinking about those who were impoverished, she's thinking about the indigenous people, all these different groups that have been marginalized in terms of the broader American society, and how to formulate law that was sensitive to the ways in which these overlapping identities and overlapping structures of inequality shape people's lives. Rather than thinking about law as universal or only applying to what we see as a normative citizen, she was really thinking about those who have been excluded and how to bring their voices and their experiences into mainstream America. She was someone who I think of as both liberal in that she's trying to work within the existing political structure, and someone who's transformative, really going beyond what is already possible. And this is a quote that I like to share from Sheila Sandoval, who is a Latinx feminist scholar. And she talks about how this is in some ways exemplifying women of color feminism, that instead of thinking about women of color activists operating along a certain political ideology or political strategy, that rather than a singular approach, there's a willingness to develop and adopt multiple methods of thinking about political change. And then for today, I really want to emphasize the third concept of feminism that we talk about in the book, aside from bridge feminism and intersectional legislative feminism, to think about the ways in which Patsy Mink's origins in the Pacific, in Hawaii, really fundamentally shaped the way she thought about political issues. So I'm just going to give you 2 and maybe 3 examples, depending on how our time is. So the first one I wanted to introduce was her advocacy for childcare. She was an advocate for a federally funded early childhood education. And this both spoke to a particular moment in American history, the late 1960s, where, as you can tell from these statistics, there's such a dire need for quality childcare, and not just some place to place children, but some place that would really, places that would really care about the educational and mental development of children. This is something that was particularly needed in the aftermath of World War II, when there was more and more women entering the workforce, and especially mothers of young children entering the workforce. But this is actually not a new phenomenon. This is something that women of color and working class women have long experienced in their lives. And one of the origins of that understanding is both about her personal life. So you have this beautiful picture of Patsy, John Mink, her husband, and Wendy Mink, who's my co-author. This is something they struggled with in their own personal lives. When Patsy graduated from law school, she was trying to figure out how to have a career and be a mother. And that was very challenging. She could not get a job that was commensurate with her training. She could only find a job as a clerk working in the library when she was in Chicago. She faced multiple forms of oppression as a woman, as an Asian American, as a mother of a young child. When she moved to Hawaii, they faced similar challenges where the big law firms would hire haole or white lawyers. The smaller law firms might hire Asian American male lawyers, but women really had very few economic opportunities. So she, hung up her own shingle, had her own practice, but that also meant that she had her time and energy channeled towards those aspirations. And she eventually became involved in politics, and she was also very deeply engaged with that. John Mink also had a career. And so it was challenging them to think about how to provide quality childcare for their own daughter. But as I said, these challenges of women of color seeking quality childcare was something that goes further back in time. And so you see here a picture of the plantation laborers, a common system of labor that exists in Hawaii, in which you have both male and female work teams, work gangs. Japanese immigrant women were especially desired because they were seen as a softening influence on Japanese immigrant men. It might prevent them from striking, from being too adamant in terms of their demands for labor rights. But the women themselves were not just seen as these housewives. Their labor was expected in the field. They also worked long, grueling hours. They were paid less than the men. And in fact, after they finished working in the fields, they also had this double, triple shift in which they cooked for their families, they cleaned for their families. And given that there were more men than women, they also did these activities for men who were unattached to women. They worked until they gave birth. They went back to working soon after giving birth. And so that recognition of this very hierarchical labor structure that was raced, that was classed, that was gendered, was something that deeply shaped Patsy Mink's understanding about labor politics and about gendered politics. I just wanted to share this quote about what motivated Patsy Mink, or how she saw the importance of the law. And I think I'm just going to read this entire quote. Right? The value of federal legislation, as others before me have pointed out, is not only that it provides a specific program and specific amounts of money. And this was very important. I saw over and over again that when Patsy advocated for particular programs, advocated for resources, she would right away communicate that back to her constituents, whether they're in Hawaii or across the nation, right, to make sure that they understood that these resources were there available for them. But that it represents a national statement of purpose and support. It provides inspiration for action leadership at other levels of government, thus having an effect far beyond the simple provisions of law themselves. So I really like this statement because it emphasized what is the importance of law? What is the importance of upholding certain principles as essential and integral to a nation? The second example I wanted to share with you about how being located in the Pacific and being deeply connected to the Pacific shape Patsy Mink's political vision is to think about the ways in which she opposed nuclear testing. I think many of you know that the United States turned to the Marshall Islands, the Trust Territories, as a region to test nuclear weapons in the aftermath of World War II, in the height of the Cold War. And various scholars and activists have pointed how enormously destructive that was, right? The equivalent of one Hiroshima-sized bomb every day for 19 years. And this testing was done in the open air and in the open water. But by the mid to late 60s, there were international agreements between the United States, the Soviet Union, and other international powers that they would no longer do that. And so what the United States next did was to create underground tests. They would dig very deep wells in places like Amchitka, which is an island off the Bering Strait of Alaska, They would deep a very deep well and plan to detonate enormously destructive bombs. There was a series of 3 bombs that were planned. The last one was 1971, the Cannikin test, and that was the largest, my understanding was the largest test that was ever done by the United States. And you can see here the statistics that it's 400 times the power of Hiroshima. Mink was very concerned about the nuclear testing that was happening here. It was something that was very much a long part of her political consciousness. Wendy can say a little bit more about this, but she would go and try to witness some of these tests, which were visible even in Hawaii, and to at least bear witness to this enormous amount of violence that was happening. For the Amchitka test in particular, it was very dangerous. People in Hawaii would write and say it's like playing Russian roulette. One of the borders or the San Andreas Fault was in this region of the world. And that if you detonate a nuclear weapon in a deep well, it could potentially generate an earthquake and potentially generate a tsunami. And the tsunami is something that does not stop at the borders. It really ripples across the Pacific. This image of these red dots is from a Science magazine article. And the American scientists who chose Amchitka did so because this is one of the most seismically active locations in the world. So each one of these red dots represents an earthquake. And they wanted to test to see if there might be that you can tell the difference between a nuclear bomb going off versus an earthquake going off. And so you can get a sense of why it was so dangerous, that people were so concerned. A lot of nuclear testing and also the storage of nuclear waste occurs on indigenous lands. And these sites are often seen as isolated, as far away, as bombable, right? That these are locations that could potentially be destroyed. So this type of argument that it's not isolated, that it actually has a permeating impact across the Pacific is trying to emphasize that this region of the world and the people and the land and the waters are worth valuing. Patsy Mink had a particular investment in environmental justice. Here she is writing to President Nixon, pointing out it's not a matter of whether it's going to pollute, but when it's going to pollute and the ways in which it's going to, because of the impact it has on the water, Pacific waters, that it's going to have a broad impact on multiple life forms. And what's really interesting to me as well, when I did research on this particular topic, there is a company in Columbus, Ohio, which is where I used to live and work. They actually were trying to guesstimate or estimate the environmental impact of these detonations. So they would try to guess how many seals would die and how many fish would die, just given the kind of enormous impact of the detonation. So it's interesting to think about the calculus of death that's viewed as acceptable, right, for scientific experimentation. And actually, Amchitka itself was a nature preserve. It was supposed to be a place where animal habitat and environmental habitat is supposed to be protected. As I was pointing out, these types of tests have an impact on indigenous peoples. The Association of American Indian Affairs pointed out that potential radioactive seepage would impact salmon, which is such an important kind of not only food source, but cultural has whole important cultural importance for Alaska Natives and other indigenous peoples. And so it's going to have a disproportionate impact on their livelihoods and their communities. And here I just want to point out that, you can think about this region as being such a vast space with tens of thousands of islands. But what these arguments are pointing out is that there's a connection between the trust territory tests that are happening in the kind of South Central Pacific, the nuclear tests that are happening in the Bering Straits. And then we may think of Hawaii as a exceptional territory because it becomes a state, but its fate is very much deeply connected to the other islands in this region. So as you can tell from the dates here, these islands came into US possession in the mid to late 19th century as part of this vision of America becoming a global power and the need to have naval stations and trading stations all across the Pacific. And this region, again, comes into prominence during World War II, where you have the Pacific Theater and the fighting that's occurring across all these different islands. And of course, during the Cold War. It's a central barrier. It's a site for military experimentation. It's a site in which the United States has to control in order to monitor what is happening geopolitically in Asia. Let me see. Do you want me to wrap up, Dawn? Should I give my third example? What do people think?
I think I would be delighted to have you continue.
Okay, all right. So the third example I want to talk about is less in the book, and it's more my current research project. It's about the 1977 National Women's Conference. This was the first and only time that the United States gave money for women to develop a national women's agenda. It was inspired by the 1975 United Nations Conference that was held in Mexico City. And people like Patsy Mink, like Bella Abzug, came back and said, well, we need to have a national gathering in the United States. In 1977, the conference was held in Houston, Texas. There were 20,000 people who attended. 56 countries were represented. Approximately 2,000 women were elected as delegates across 50 states and 6 territories. And again, as I mentioned, they were given the charge of creating a national women's agenda. So at each of these pre-conferences, women and some men came together. They debated issues, they developed resolutions. So they elected delegates, but then also identified issues that they wanted to forward on to Houston so there could be collective conversation there. A few things I find really interesting about this conference. There was a legislative mandate, and Patsy Mink co-authored legislation and sponsored legislation to create this conference and to allocate funding. There was a legislative mandate to ensure that there would be diversity of representation. And some states complied and others did not. So some states sent all white delegates. Some states were mobilized against by anti-feminists who wanted to make sure they elected people who were against the ERA, who were against abortion. But overall, there were about a third of the women who were there who were people of color. And some scholars have even said that that's where the term women of color was created. And I'm not completely sure about that, but I think it's very interesting that there was a significant political formation. And you see on the right, here's the Minority Women's Caucus coming together to announce their political agenda. There were various resolutions, but the women of color found that the agenda that was given to them or kind of written for them was not substantive enough. And so there were 4 different caucuses: American Indian, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, African American. They met separately to develop their own agendas, but then they all came together to announce it together. So you see here Coretta Scott King introducing the last plank, which is the African American women's plank. So how is this representative of Patsy Mink and the way that the Pacific shaped her political outlook? First of all, she wanted to make sure that small locations, so locations with small populations, still had substantive representation. Her colleague, Spark Matsunaga, argued that, well, small locations might have 2 representatives, right? So this is along the lines of the Senate model, right? Every state has 2. But she argued that there had to be at least 10, that even in places that are considered small, places like Hawaii and other locations, that there was a diversity of perspectives. And so there need to be at least 10 to be represented. And the number of delegates vary by location. So I've been working with students to try to document all the delegates that came from California, and we had 96 plus 5 delegates. 5 alternates. The other aspect that I find really interesting is that Patsy Mink really wanted to make sure that the territories were represented, that it wasn't just the states that had these pre-conferences, but there was funding for the territories. And I think that's so important given the history of Hawaii as a territory, and then Mink's understanding of the ongoing status of territories. And many of them are islands, right? Islands in the Caribbean, islands in the Pacific, but also Washington, D.C. And then finally, when Patsy Mink argued for having this conference, it was supposed to happen initially on 1976, which is the US bicentennial. And so it was a chance to reflect on the history of the nation, to think about the current status of women, and to think about the future, what might happen next. And when Patsy Mink testified in the Senate for the funding for this conference, she talked about the history of Hawaii and the ways in which Queen Liliuokalani, the last native sovereign, was forcibly deposed, forced to leave her office, her status by Haole military and economic interests. And she pointed out that actually this history of destabilizing Native nations led by women was part of a broader history throughout the United States. That she said, you can go any location and you can see this process. So I think each of these examples gives some insight in the ways in which being from Hawaii, having this specific world awareness shaped Patsy's worldview. Okay, I'm just going to end here. Actually, I don't know if I'm going to play this video because I'd love to have conversation with you all. But this is from Kimberly Basford, her film Ahead of the Majority. And this is a phrase that Patsy Mink spoke about, used when she was running for the US Senate in 1975-76. She didn't win, but I think it's such a beautiful statement about her political vision. Right? It is easy enough to vote right and be consistently with the majority, but it is more often more important to be ahead of the majority. And this means being willing to cut the first furrow in the ground and stand alone for a while if necessary. And Patsy was someone who really valued working with social activists, working with communities. And so she wasn't always alone, but I love that spirit of hers, that she's willing to take things, take stances that are not popular, to take stances because she believed in the political principle, and then to persuade others that this is the right way to move ahead. I'm going to go ahead and stop.
Hey, thank you, Judy. A wonderful presentation. We'd love to start some Q&A, and there's a couple of different ways that we can do that. As I mentioned before, certainly you can raise your hand both physically if you wish, if you can't quite figure out the Zoom controls, or you can do it in the Zoom controls, or you can drop it into the chat. I'll get started while folks are thinking. This is actually a question I asked Judy when we were sort of queuing up. The time frame and for developing and doing the research on this book, and maybe the genesis that got you and Wendy started, on this project, to talk a little bit about that.
Wendy, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it's embarrassing or proof of dedication, but I've been at this for many, many years. I'd say since, in a concerted way, since maybe 2008. My mother's papers landed at the Library of Congress, and shortly after she passed away, it took several years for the library to process the papers. And once they became available to researchers, I began to work in them, sort of moving through them chronologically to try to figure out how to tell her story, how to talk about the various episodes that were sort of major pivotal experiences for her as part of the political project she was engaged in. I kind of floundered after a couple of years of puttering in the papers. Mainly because I couldn't settle on a narrative voice to tell the story. I didn't even know what to call her. Do I refer to her as Patsy? Do I refer to her as Mom? I couldn't sort of figure out how to either combine or choose between the scholarly voice that I am used to writing in and the daughterly voice that is inevitably part of how I think about my mother and think about her political life. So I floundered, and magically, a few hundred miles away in Ohio, Judy discovered the existence of the papers. We didn't know each other at the time, and embarked on her own research project. And you can take it away, Judy.
It's hard to believe that it's been 10 years. And I remember telling Wendy, I think it was going to take 10 years, and she works at a faster pace than I do. So I think she was aghast. But I would drive from Columbus to Washington, D.C., and it takes about 8 or 9 hours. And I usually would stay for a week at a time. My kids are older now. They're 18 and 14, but they were younger back then. And I have a wonderful husband partner who was great at parenting. But I could only go 1 week at a time. So I loved looking at all the materials of the Library of Congress. I would usually have dinner with Wendy a couple times a week when I was in town. We usually had Japanese food. At the time, there was a really great Japanese restaurant just around the corner from where she lived. And we're very sad that it's no longer there. And then we usually have Chinese takeout. And I loved having these conversations where I would say, oh, I found this in the archive. And she's like, oh, this is what was happening in our family at the time. So we began with oral histories. That's something that I've used for all my books. But when I found out that her mother, that Patsy wanted Wendy to write a book, it just made a lot of sense for us to collaborate together. And so I feel much better knowing that she's there to make sure I have things right.
All right, thank you. We are open for questions. I will try to find folks that are asking questions here.
Or comments from anybody who knew.
Or comments, right?
Yeah.
Yes. I see that many people in the audience had a connection with Patsy, so I'd love to hear your stories. It's good to see you, Amy. I remember talking.
I know this is not a shy group, so please do. I guess let me ask this, and maybe this is most appropriate for Wendy. Were there things that you found that maybe was part of Judy's research that were even surprising to you as Patsy's daughter? Something maybe that you either didn't know or maybe didn't quite understand the context in the same way, coming at it from the researcher's perspective rather than the daughter's perspective?
Well, we went through the same material, so I kind of encountered everything separately from Judy encountering them. And I'd have to say that, I don't know, you might catch me up with a very specific question, but in general, I'd have to say I wasn't really surprised by anything. There was a lot that was fleshed out. There were a lot of details that were supplied by the papers. There was, I would periodically think, oh, I didn't know that person was at that meeting, kind of thing. But I was aware of almost everything, except for some of the stories that preceded my consciousness. Like from her law school experience and her attempts to secure a law license initially in Hawaii and things like that. But everything that was part of her public political life was, the broad contours were familiar to me. In part because I was an only child, maybe because I was a politically wired child, whatever. I grew up in very close proximity to what she did. And my father lived in close proximity to it. So I kind of, we talked about everything. So.
Right. Makes sense. I just was curious about those two different roles.
I was just
Amy and then David Jacobs. Amy.
I actually put my question in the chat area.
Oh, I missed the question.
Anyway, okay. I'm not going to ask a question about the book per se, which I have to say I found fascinating. Mainly for me, it was a trip down memory lane because even some of the things that I hadn't experienced or happened before I knew Patsy and John, I had heard her talk about in one guise or another. So for me, it was a very, very, very pleasant experience. And since I absolutely adored both of them, It was great fun. And very interesting. My question, I don't know whether either of you saw it, but in today's Washington Post, there's a moving op-ed by a native Hawaiian. Did either of you see that?
I didn't, but
No,
if you could maybe
I didn't.
summarize the main argument.
Well, I mean, he was basically, he was arguing it. I believe the title of it was "The Chickens Aren't the Problem." And he took off on the wild chickens in Hawaii and went back to the history of how they came in, and then talked about how the haoles coming in, the tourists, the Navy, the etc., were destroying the environment. They were just, I mean, just went through a whole series of things, much more eloquently than I have now stated it. And so I was just wondering how either of you would postulate how Patsy would have reacted. I mean, there's so many times when I think, what would Patsy have said? And having this op-ed show up on the day of this book discussion just seemed too good to pass up.
Do you want to begin, Wendy, or do you want me to begin?
Well, I don't really have an answer because I haven't read the op-ed, but from what Amy describes, it sounds like something that would certainly resonate for my mom, and she would appreciate that it was written and so forth. But since I don't know more about the piece, I can't really go further.
No, I was actually just writing a lesson. I've been writing textbook curriculum for high school and maybe college students. And I was writing a lesson about Patsy Mink's environmental politics and how being Hawaii, she talks about how you're so attuned to the environment, right? The water, the winds, the lush landscape, that you learn to kind of really appreciate that and to think about your relationship to the natural environment. But Hawaii is so developed, right? So you have the military presence, and that demands a certain use of land and water. There's military testing. I talked about Mchitka in my talk, but there's also the bombing of Kaulalawe. There's the use of chemical weapons. Hawaii is also a place where it's incredibly economically developed. So you have the plantation system and you have the tourist industry. And both those industries demand a certain use of land and water, a prioritization of these resources away from people who tend to be locals, and especially from people who are Native Hawaiians. So I do see that Patsy Mink was someone who's very committed to statehood, because that was in a way for people of color, for people in Hawaii to have an equal status within the nation. But I find over and over again that she's very sensitive and sympathetic to Native Hawaiian activists who are trying to reclaim land, reclaim rights. And that she will often say, okay, what is it that what is it that your community wants? Like, how can I support you? Even when she's not necessarily in agreement, she'll say, okay, I think it's your right to be able to develop a response, a proposal, and I will try to introduce it. So I find her someone who's very sympathetic to people who tend to be marginalized, who have not had kind of full democratic rights. And she's very respectful of communities that are seeking, right, self-determination, sovereignty.
Okay. David, you took your hand down. Are you no longer asking your question, or?
No, I just wanted to stop bothering people with my hand. But I just wanted to say,
okay,
in case nobody else has mentioned this, that Patsy was extremely funny. I had an extraordinary time with her at the ADA retreat in 1980. She was very approachable, and she just had us all in stitches for hours upon end. So that's something that's worthy of note. She managed to be effective and progressive with an extraordinary sense of humor as another accessory. Thank you.
all right.
Thanks so much for sharing that, David. I'm thinking about, I think, Kimberly Basford's film, and one of the aides was saying that she would mark things in black because it was important, but then everything was important, so everything was marked in black. So it's great to hear that she has this kind of personal side, this funny side, because it seemed like she was also very, so serious and dedicated as well.
Other questions, folks? John Bickle. Aloha.
Thank you. I worked for Patsy Mink in 1986 when she ran for governor. And I remember on the night of the gubernatorial debate afterwards, we went to Andrew's restaurant and had a dinner. And at that dinner, more than any other time during that campaign and any other time I spent with her, she spent over an hour explaining in detail the 1960s. And she was incredibly passionate about Robert F. Kennedy. And she told the story of coming back and seeing you, Wendy, at the television set at the death of RFK. And very, very moving. I'm just wondering, is it me, given my time period, or is it something that's true of Patsy? But the 1960s are so a passionate part of what she was, and that time period of civil rights, that time period of education, that time period that led up to Title IX, is such a big part of what she is. Or am I just kind of skewed in my perspective?
Well, I think it was a big part of most of the legislative advocacy that she engaged in the 60s and early 70s was about democratization in the United States, right? Democratizing the polity, spreading equality, and contriving mechanisms to assure equal justice. So yes, I mean, all of those themes sort of ran to the core of who she was. But in addition, I think you'd have to say, at least in retrospect, maybe it didn't always feel this way at the time. In the 60s and early 70s, there was hope, bracketing the war for the time being. There was certainly on the social justice agenda, there was hope, and there were breakthroughs, and there were some victories, including Title IX. Including much of the Great Society until the neoliberals started to roll it back and so forth. So in that sense, too, one looks back to the good old days of when you could actually pass legislation that would assure a marginalized group a measure of equity and a measure of inclusion in the polity, versus sort of the 80s and the 90s for sure, when the sort of neoliberalism completely, cramped the whole sort of range of discourse on most social and international issues, and sort of prejudged pretty negative outcomes. So it's hard to embrace the politics of those decades, right? To build your sort of future argument for optimism and activism and hope.
I'll just say that I thought it was very interesting looking at the period in which Patsy is supporting Robert Kennedy. And, he comes from a very storied political family, but it was interesting to think about what was going on behind the scenes, and that actually supporting was somewhat politically risky because people were still rallying around Johnson at the time. And so supporting him was seen, potentially as a death knell for a politician. So I think that's another example where she's sticking to her guns and really trying to think about, like, who does she really value as a political leader, and she's willing to kind of take political risks. I didn't expect that about Robert F. Kennedy. And then something else I find really beautiful about Patsy Mink is that she seems like such a consistent political leader. Like, whether it's in the 80s or the 90s, like, she's still fighting those same fights. Like, she still wants childcare. She still wants environmental justice. She still wants, like, protection for people who are poor. And people often think like, what happened to the 60s? And I feel like she just kept going, like, 60s through 2002. And I just love that spirit about her.
Okay. Other questions? Last call here before we wrap. Well, thank you all again, participants. Wonderful questions. Thank you, Judy and Wendy, for you sharing your perspectives. If you have not already, please go get the book. I will post the link one more time in the chat for you if you missed it. And it was wonderful to hear this and to have you be a part of ADA's 75th anniversary book discussion series. Thanks again. Good night, all.
Thank you so much for joining. Yeah, and I love the stories that are being shared in chat. Thank you so much for being here.
Aloha.
All right. Aloha.